our current assessment indicates that the world economy has largely avoided a broad-based contraction despite the unprecedented shocks of the last few years and the most prolonged period of the monetary tightening in the history. So for the 2025, our projection is that the global growth will be around 2.8%, similar to the 2024. Lower inflation, monetary easing, and the recovery of the international trade underpinned this relatively stable outlook. Nevertheless, we know that this rate remains well below the pre-pandemic average of the 3.2%, the recorded over 2010 to 2019. The recovery remains uneven, driven primarily by a few large economies. Subdued growth prospects pose significant challenges, particularly for the developing countries. Growth in over 90% of the least developed countries is projected to fall short of the 7%, the target needed for the achievement of many SDGs. Several structural factors, including the high debt burdens, limited physical space, weak investment, and the low productivity growth, continue to hinder the economic prospects for developing countries. Climate change and the geopolitical tensions, with their potentially for spilling over the effects into the economic performance, posed additional risks. Despite these challenges, our report highlights concrete pathways in which countries can work both individually and in collaboration to place the world on a more robust path towards the sustainable development. Addressing debt challenges, curbing illicit financial flows, and strengthening domestic resource mobilization can increase the public revenues for investing in the SDGs. For many countries, the rising global demand for the minerals critical for the energy transition presents an unique opportunity to stimulate growth, create jobs, and reduce the poverty and inequality. Well, dear colleagues, history also reminds us that such opportunities must be carefully managed. Supporting developing countries in leveraging those resources effectively, balancing the economic benefits with the imperatives of the inclusive social development and environmental sustainability can accelerate the SDG progress, not just in these countries, but across the whole world. So, dear friends, the WESPAC 2025 is a call to action rooted in its evidence-based analysis of the current state of the economy, as well as short-term forecasts. Urgent actions are needed to address the debt sustainability challenges in many countries, especially the countries in the special situations. To close the gap in technology, financing, and infrastructure that hinder equitable growth, and to ensure that the accelerated energy transition reduces climate risks for all of us. The challenges we face are complex, but the solutions are within our reach if we work together. I trust that the 2025 edition of the WESP will serve as an insightful resource, offering the guidance towards building a more inclusive, resilient, and sustainable global economy.
If you look at our forecasts and you also look back at what has been happening, we've had kind of 5 years of growth performance that's below the 3.2% average in the decade leading up to 2019. So this may sound a bit like what we were saying last year, but actually if you lift the hood and take a peek at the engine, things are humming. One of these is that global inflation is expected to slow further from an estimated 4% in 2024 to 3.4% in 2025. And that means in 2025, that's a drop of almost 60% relative to its peak in 2022. And in response, most central banks are lowering their rates. Of the 100 plus that we track, about 2/3 had already done so by the end of last year. roughly double from the end of the previous year. One big uncertain factor is actually the duration and extent of the easing, because inflationary pressures continue to lurk. And particularly since the policy decisions of the major central banks, such as the Fed and the ECB, kind of reverberate across the world, this is a significant source of uncertainty as we enter this year. Nevertheless, the easing has already led to modest turnarounds in investment and in cross-border financing in 2024, which is after a 2-year slump. And we have also seen a significant rebound in global trade. Hamid will, I'm sure, talk about that in both goods and services. Now, that's a global picture, but for developing countries, there continue to be appreciable differences vis-a-vis developed ones. For developing countries, our forecast is 4.3% in 2025 and 4.2% in 2026, remaining well below the 5.2% average in the previous decade. Now, in comparative terms, this gap with respect to the pre-pandemic trend is larger for developing countries than developed countries. In other words, slower to catch up. And while inflation is trending downwards in developing countries too, it remains noticeably higher. It's estimated to be about 6% in 24 and projected at 5.1% in 25. These inflation numbers are 1.5 times those for developed countries, and they have been persisting. And that's a sign of how severe the cost of living crisis is for most of us outside of this room. And, we might say that there's subpar growth in both developed and developing countries. There's been monetary tightening. So isn't there some kind of parity? Well, actually, developing countries face far more severe constraints. In 2024, if you look at the amount of public money that was used to service debt, to pay off interest, the median developing country was 11.1% of its revenues went for this. That's more than 4 times the amount for the median developed country. African countries actually allocated over a quarter of their revenues on average, which leaves very little for meaningful investment in the SDGs. Even among developing countries, as our USG said, there are variations, with the more vulnerable, such as the least developed countries, tending to be systematically worse in relative terms. So what does this mean for the SDGs? All of it is that the prognosis is challenging, although we have had good news, modestly good news in terms of things like extreme poverty rates returning to pre-pandemic averages. The way forward is not so straightforward. There have been cumulative setbacks over the past few years. Growth expectations, as we are seeing, have been modest, and there are significant downside risks from climate shocks or spillovers of geopolitical tensions. However, at the same time, the overall expectation that there will be stable growth in the midst of all this divergence means that there is really a scope for international cooperation that can combine with individual country efforts. The report has detailed recommendations. My colleague Hamid will be covering several of them. I just want to highlight a little bit more, apart from the resolving the public debt burdens issue, which has already come up and which we expect will be taken up in FFT and other important fora as well, is about accelerating the pace of the just energy transition. So the transition itself benefits all, and if we can ensure that developing countries with the minerals needed to drive the transition can turn these resources into SDG gains, that is a significant win. The reason we're bringing this up is because many of the countries that are identified as having significant amounts of these minerals are also home to some of the largest populations living in poverty and inequality. So if we get this right, it could open the doors to transformative results. Experience with natural resource-led development indicates that such outcomes can't be guaranteed. They can often turn around, but there is a scope for enabling them through multi-stakeholder efforts.
The world economy is on a stable and steady growth trajectory. Having said that, we need to qualify. Obviously, there are some challenges. The economy is not in the best state of the world. It's not in the worst state either. The growth we have projected for this year 2.8% and slight improvement in next year in 2026 to 2.9%. That's for global growth. But 3 points to underscore here. First, that world economy avoided a much anticipated, much feared as sort of a hard landing that was expected in 2023. And that expectation persisted in 2024 as well, that there can be some kind of a contraction that was avoided.
Not moving the slides.
And the second point is that post-pandemic growth has already been said that it remains below the pre-pandemic average of 3.2% that we had between 2010 and 2019. And that growth gap is quite significant. And it is a reason for us to look at how policies can be calibrated to boost growth to pre-pandemic levels. And the third issue is that, of course, there are significant, some headwinds that we cannot ignore. One of the headwinds is that uncertainties and trade tensions that we see are already there. We see shrinking fiscal space in many countries, especially in developing countries. And on top of that, we see a growing climate crisis, climate risks in many parts of the world. On the positive side, of course, with inflation falling, we see some monetary easing already began, and it will continue probably in 2025 to a larger extent, and that would provide some respite, some support for stimulating growth going forward. Now let's look at the growth performance across regions. And when you talk about economic growth, we think about what does it mean for economic development. Growth and development are not necessarily one-on-one. When you talk about economic impact or development impact of growth, we need to look at per capita growth performance. And there we see quite a bit of variation across regions. And we see, especially except for South Asia region, in 2024, all the regions had per capita growth rate below their pre-pandemic averages. Most striking was the growth rate that we saw in Africa in 2024, which was almost a half a percentage point per capita GDP growth rate. Not enough to reduce poverty, not enough to reduce all these systemic issues, that challenges that we see in those countries. And also regionally, if you look at Western Asia and other regions, Latin America and Caribbean, also growth performance was subpar relative to pre-pandemic levels. We see some improvements in 2025 on per capita terms, but not significant. In some regions, we'll see some improvement, but not broad-based. In terms of the most vulnerable group of countries, we see that states, small island developing states, they did relatively well in 2024 and would probably do well in 2025 as well because of the recovery, quick recovery in tourism in many of these countries. Inflation, I would not go into the details. There's quite a bit of variation between developed and developing countries. Oh, that came off. So one of the things that we have to look at is that this trend is, inflation has trended downward across the board with some exceptions, especially if you look at the regional variations in inflation. Still, Africa's inflation is double digit on average, which is still quite worrisome. And also we also see a high inflation in Western Asia as well, 16% average inflation. And with that inflation in many parts of the world, especially where there's a significant amount of poverty, we are witnessing a simultaneous food insecurity problem and a cost of living crisis. And that is the challenge with low growth and combination of low growth and high inflation, where employment job creation is not sufficient to lift the income level of those people, where the inflation is actually cutting back their purchasing power. So a double whammy on both sides. So poverty reduction in many countries, although we have reached the pre-pandemic level of poverty, but it's slow. Poverty reduction, pace of poverty reduction is slow in most parts of the world. Global trade, that's where the good news is. It rebounded sharply in 2024 from reached 3.4% growth rate compared to only 0.9% the previous year in 2023, a massive rebound. And that is quite was a good news for the global economy, and we expect trade to remain strong in 2025, with some variation, of course. Investment also picked up in 2024, and we continue to expect some investment momentum, especially given the low interest rates probably would support investment in many parts of the world. Labor markets, again, mixed picture between developed and developing countries. Developed countries recovered very quickly from the pandemic-related shocks to the employment. Actually, total employment in developed countries, it was 3.6% higher than they had. It was during the pre-pandemic period. And same with labor force participation rate. Female participation rate actually increased significantly. But the story is very different for the developing countries. Labor market is still weak. In some countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa, unemployment rate is over 30%. Female participation rate actually went in the opposite direction in many developing countries, from 54% in 2019 to 51% in 2024. And another important indicator or point of concern for us is that youth unemployment in many parts of the world remains very high, elevated. NEET, one indicator that we observe, not in employment, education, and training, that is also significantly high, in some cases over 25% in South Asia,